Okay, we're back on LinkedIn. I have an amazing person to talk to today, which I really appreciate you coming on with me, Chuck. Chuck Andrews. His profile will be linked down below. But I really, really appreciate Chuck from Friends of Chuck to come talk with us about transition. Ray called him out on the last post, and Chuck, you were great. You hit me up immediately and you said, "What can I do to help?" Because you believe in this brother and you've been through this.
Yeah.
And one thing we've talked about a lot of stuff with transition. One thing that I think would be perfect to start out with our conversation is let's talk about brand. You are an icon in this industry because you established yourself as a brand. And I'd like to think that everybody is a brand here. But talk a little bit about FOC and Chuck as a brand and what that means to these folks that are in transition from military and law enforcement and public safety into the private sector and how important that is to what they're doing with transition.
It is. And Scott, it's good to be here. And hey, kudos on the show. You had Ray O'Hara, who is his own walking moniker of security history, isn't he?
That's right.
Ray's a great guy, and he tried to gig me there just a little bit with all hat and no cattle. But since we're talking about brands, and I brand my cattle, right? So it's a good play there, right? So let's talk about brand. Yeah, Friends of Chuck. Listen, you have got to separate yourself from the herd, right? You got to create a delta. You've got to put your own brand and moniker on what it is you're going to do. And during a transition from the government sector and into the private sector, you're going to have to find your own hat. All right. Now that comes in lots of different meanings for different people, right? So I encourage everybody, and for me at Friends of Chuck, I built that around that very specifically so I could differentiate myself and try to bring value in everything that I do and build that reputation across the industry. And I did it by saying, look, Friends of Chuck is about dreaming big. Everybody wants to have big dreams, right? You get done with your government job, you want to be a CSO or a security director, you have to have big dreams. Nobody dreams small. If you dream small, you'll be small. If you dream big, you'll be big, right?
That's right.
Secondly, you got to know how to have fun. Don't get involved in things where you can't have fun. Why would you do that and be miserable? I think 80% of people find themselves in miserable situations when they should be engaged. They got to know how to have fun. So they have to engage in knowing how to have fun, right? So if it's not fun, make it fun. And lastly, you got to get shit done.
That's right. That's right.
Right? You can't just not be of value, right? Get it done, and people will appreciate and recognize that. You go back to saying, hey, actions speak louder than words, right? And that's what it's all about right there.
That's a great point about that. Your last point rings true with me when I talk with a lot of folks who are coming out of the public sector. And what's your value back to the organization? We've talked about corporate culture in one of our previous talks with Ray. If you've got somebody who is, because we're going to have a lot of folks coming out of military and law enforcement. We've been at war for 20 years. Yeah. We had a huge push for hiring law enforcement in the 90s and in the 80s. And there are folks that are looking at retirement age right now, but they're still too young to not do anything, right?
Right.
What do you say to somebody who maybe was a sergeant or lieutenant in a police department or a law enforcement agency, and they're kind of that mid-level supervisor, and they're coming into the private sector now? What do you tell them about their brand? How do they identify what their brand is? Because their identity has been wrapped around a badge or a patch or an organization.
I know.
What do you tell them about that?
Well, I lived and breathed that, right? But I kind of saw it early while I was still in law enforcement, right? Working with the community and crime, I worked in crime prevention and community policing and McGruff the Crime Dog and Nancy Reagan Just Say No and DARE and all this stuff, right? Which was very community oriented. Prevention made sense to me. Doing things after the fact didn't. That's where I started to build my identity, is to focus on the crime prevention world and the positivity that went with that out in the community. So what do I say to that lieutenant with that police department? Start now, right? Attend an ASIS meeting and start networking with people in the private sector. Get engaged with those folks. Look at the certifications, whether it's CPP or PCI or other industry certification, IFPO, International Foundation of Protection Officers. All these different groups start offering, so start wrapping your mind around what risk looks like from the perspective of the private sector. Start taking yourself and engulfing yourself in that immersion, right? And you want to learn a second language, then go to that country, and the only way you're going to survive, do that in the private security realm. Start talking to people, get yourself immersed in that space. Those are some really good first steps.
Do you think that brand also carries over? We see a lot of our friends, especially from federal law enforcement or from big city police agencies, that will transition based on their former agency. You know, right. I'm thinking like FBI, DEA, diplomatic security, LAPD, NYPD, those kinds of things, Secret Service. They carry a brand and identity unto themselves. Is that positive? Is that negative? What do you think about that? Is that good?
Well, yeah, I think it's good. Look, DEA guys end up working for the pharmaceutical companies. Secret Service works for financial institutions or executive protection firms. We do have a couple here running oil and gas here in the Houston area. FBI, usually financial, some manufacturing, kind of a mix of it all, right? Mm-hmm. Those jobs used to be guaranteed to them, but not anymore. It's very much changed and it's very competitive, right?
Okay.
But they do have that because they got to work the big national cases under Title 18 across the country, right? High net worth, see a lot of CIA guys running their show, right? Yeah, family operations. And that still holds true if you've been around, you know, like Ray and I, 35, 40 years in the business, right? Of course, I'm better looking than Ray, but don't tell him.
He doesn't watch these. Okay.
I know he doesn't. I know he doesn't. So, but yeah, seriously, that brand, you're right, that identity, it aligns well because DEA, right? Gee, pharmaceutical, right?
Good transition.
It just makes sense, right, as part of that. But still, you know, for that law enforcement officer, which I was and I still am today, almost 39 years later, it's tough for some folks to really make that move because of the value of, you know, being in, you know, pulling your firearm every night. You're not going to do that in private security, right? But I do want to share something that they can take, all of them. All right. You worked in a business, law enforcement people work in a business where you are actually in the people business. That is huge because you have dealt with the worst of the worst and hopefully the best of the best. That entire range that you experienced has great value in the private security business because you're going to be working with people and clients and customers and the public, depending on the kind of role that you are. That is a huge skill set, and you need to recognize that and make sure you're leveraging it.
And we'll pause here. That's great points, Chuck. We'll continue this discussion here in just a second. And we're going to talk about education certification. Thanks, Chuck.